I'm Evelyn Reed, 78 years old, a woman, and I was recently designated an additional guest at my own granddaughter's baby shower. That isn't the beginning of the story, but it is the beginning of the end. Before that day, I was simply a mother, a grandmother, a matriarch. I was the sun around which my family's universe seemed to orbit, dispensing warmth, light, and most importantly, a steady financial gravity that kept them all comfortably in their paths. I see now that when a sun begins to age, to shrink even a little, the planets it once held in place start to wobble, looking for a new center of gravity. My life with my late husband, David, was a simple one, built on the solid bedrock of love and mutual respect. We weren't wealthy, not by any stretch of the imagination, but we were diligent. David was an engineer, a man who saw the world in structures and systems, and he built our life with the same care he put into his blueprints. We saved, we invested wisely, and by the time he passed away a decade ago, he had left me with a foundation so secure, I never had to worry about my future. More than that, he left me with enough to be the kind of mother and grandmother I'd always wanted to be. Generous. Our two children, Sarah and Robert, were the cornerstones of my world. Sarah, my eldest at 55, was David's opposite. Where he saw structure, she saw aesthetics. She married a man in finance, and together they built a life that looked perfect from the outside, a large home in a gated community, European cars, and children enrolled in the best schools. I was proud of her success, but over the years, a subtle friction had grown between us. It was a friction born of her deep-seated belief that my simpler tastes were a reflection of a life less lived. I remember one Christmas, she'd hosted dinner at her house. I'd brought my famous sweet potato casserole in the same Corningware dish I'd used for 40 years. Sarah took it from me with a tight smile, whisked it into the kitchen, and I later saw her transferring it into a sleek, white ceramic server that matched her minimalist decor. She said, "Mother, we need everything to look cohesive for the photos." She didn't see a dish full of love and tradition, she saw a blemish on her carefully curated Instagram post. Robert, my son, was 52, and his life had taken a different trajectory. He had his father's kindness, but none of his structural discipline. After a promising start in marketing, he'd sunk his savings and a good portion of mine into a craft brewery that had folded within 3 years. His wife had left him shortly after, and he'd been adrift ever since, working a middling sales job and living in a condo I'd helped him secure. He was a good man, a loving son, but the failure had broken something in him. He became pliant, easily led, and more often than not, it was his older sister Sarah who did the leading. He'd call me every Sunday, but our conversations were peppered with sighs about bills and veiled references to his financial straits. He never asked directly, he didn't have to. I would always offer, and he would always accept with a gratitude that felt more like relief. I never minded helping. In my mind, that was my purpose. I helped Sarah and her husband with the down payment on that first big house. I helped Robert stay afloat after his business collapsed, and for my grandchildren, I was a bottomless well of support. When Sarah's daughter Lily was accepted into a prestigious private university, I was the one who established the college fund to ensure she would graduate debt-free. It was my joy, or so I told myself. I believed my generosity was the glue holding us all together. I never considered that it might be the solvent, slowly dissolving the bonds of genuine affection until only the expectation of money remained. So when Lily, my sweet granddaughter, announced her pregnancy, I was overjoyed. The first great-grandchild, a new branch on the family tree I had so carefully nurtured. The baby shower was all Sarah could talk about for months. It was to be held at the Oak Valley Country Club, a place where membership fees rivaled the annual salary of a teacher. Sarah insisted on handling everything. "Mother, you just show up and look proud," she'd said, patting my hand. I spent weeks preparing my gift. I knitted a soft, cashmere baby blanket, each stitch a prayer for the new life to come. And tucked inside the card, alongside my handwritten message of love, I placed a check for $6,000. It was to be the first deposit into a trust fund for my great-grandchild. It was a significant amount, but it was what I did. I was Evelyn Reed, the matriarch, the provider. It was my role, my joy. I wrapped it all in shimmering paper, tied it with a silk ribbon, and felt a deep, satisfying sense of purpose. I was ready to show up and look proud. I had no idea I was also meant to be invisible. The day of the baby shower dawned bright and unseasonably warm. I chose a lavender dress, one David had always loved, and fastened his mother's pearl necklace around my neck. Driving up the winding road to the Oak Valley Country Club, I felt a familiar flutter of anxiety. These places, with their hushed tones and air of effortless wealth, always made me feel like an outsider. My world was one of well-tended gardens, worn-in armchairs, and the smell of baking bread. Sarah's world was one of valet parking, abstract art, and the crisp, sterile scent of money. Inside, the ballroom was a sea of pastel pinks and whites. Balloons floated to the ceiling like gentle clouds, and a string quartet played softly in the corner. Dozens of women in expensive dresses milled about, sipping champagne and laughing with practiced ease. Sarah was a whirlwind of social grace, greeting guests with air kisses and a dazzling smile. She saw me and rushed over, her face a mask of frantic hospitality. "Mother, you're here, isn't it all just perfect?" she said, squeezing my arm a little too tightly. Before I could answer, she was pulled away by someone else, leaving me standing alone at the entrance. I looked around for a familiar face, for Robert or Lily, but saw none. Near the grand entrance, perched on an ornate easel, was a large gold-framed seating chart. I walked over, my heels sinking into the plush carpet, and scanned the elegant calligraphy for my name. I saw the parents' table with Sarah and her husband John listed. I saw the bridal party table, a holdover from Lily's wedding, filled with her closest friends. And then I saw Lily's table, the table of honor, with my granddaughter, her new husband Derek, and his parents listed as hosts. I scanned the list again and again. My name, Evelyn Reed, was nowhere to be found on any of the main tables. A cold knot of confusion tightened in my stomach. Surely it was a mistake, an oversight. I continued to scan the chart, my eyes moving down the list of lesser tables, circles of acquaintances and distant relatives. And that's when I saw it at the very bottom of the chart, almost an afterthought. It wasn't even a proper table listing. It was a small, separate heading, Overflow. Underneath it were two names. One I didn't recognize, and the other was simply a single chair. It read, Chair 1, Additional Guest. The words didn't compute. Additional guest. The phrase echoed in the silent chamber of my heart. An additional guest, I who had funded the education of the mother-to-be. I, the great-grandmother of the baby being celebrated. It felt like a slap, sharp and stinging. I took a slow, deep breath, my hand trembling slightly as it rested on my purse. It had to be a mistake, a terrible, mortifying mistake by the event planner. Sarah would be horrified when I told her. With that small sliver of hope, I began to walk through the crowded room, my eyes searching for the physical location of this insulting designation. I passed the beautifully decorated tables, each with a towering floral centerpiece. I passed the gift table, already groaning under the weight of elegantly wrapped presents, and then I saw it. Tucked away in a dim alcove so far from the main celebration that the string quartet was barely audible, was a single, small, round table. Next to it was the door to the restrooms, which swung open and shut, emitting a faint chemical smell. On the table was one solitary place setting, and next to it a single chair. It was positioned in such a way that its occupant would have a clear view of nothing but the decorative wall panel and the steady traffic to and from the bathroom. The place card, printed in the same elegant script as the main chart, confirmed my fate. It didn't even bear a name. It simply read, Additional Guest. I stood there for a long moment, frozen. The sounds of the party, the laughter, the music, the clinking of glasses, seemed to fade into a distant roar. My cheeks burned with a shame so hot it felt like a fever. Every person who walked past, every woman who glanced in my direction seemed to know. They seemed to see the label that had been assigned to me. I was not the matriarch. I was not family. I was an add-on, an afterthought, an inconvenience seated by the toilets. My last bit of hope was that my seat at the main table had been reserved, and this was all a clerical error. I turned my gaze toward the head of the room, to Lily's table. There she was, glowing, her hands resting on her round belly. My heart ached with love for her, and then I looked at the people around her. There was Sarah, beaming. There was her husband, John. And there, in the seat to Lily's right, the place of honor traditionally reserved for a grandparent, sat Derek, her new husband of less than a year. He was laughing, throwing his head back, completely at ease. He belonged. And in that single, devastating moment, I understood that I did not. My body moved before my mind had fully processed the command. I walked through the maze of tables, my lavender dress feeling like a costume for a role I was no longer permitted to play. Each step was heavy, deliberate. The path to Sarah's table felt miles long. As I drew closer, the happy chatter grew louder, a wall of sound that I had to push through. Sarah was in the middle of a story, her hands gesturing animatedly. She saw me approaching and her smile faltered for a fraction of a second, a barely perceptible tightening around her eyes. "Mother," she said, her voice a little too bright, "is everything all right? You look pale." The other people at the table quieted, their eyes turning to me. I felt like a specimen under a microscope. I leaned down, keeping my voice low so only she could hear. "Sarah, there seems to be a mistake with the seating." She waved a dismissive hand. "Oh, the seating is a nightmare, isn't it? So hard to fit everyone." "My seat," I said, my voice trembling slightly despite my best efforts to control it. "The chart has me by the restrooms, the card just says additional guest." Sarah's eyes flickered with something I couldn't quite decipher. It wasn't surprise, it was closer to annoyance. She took a delicate sip of her champagne. "Mother, please don't make a scene," she whispered back, her smile pinned in place. "We had to make some difficult choices. The tables are for immediate family and our closest friends." "I am immediate family," I said, the words feeling foreign and foolish on my tongue. "I am her grandmother." "And we love that you are," she said, her tone condescendingly sweet, as if explaining a complex concept to a child. "But Derek is the baby's father, he's the future, he belongs at this table. It's about the new family unit Lily is creating." Her words hit me harder than the seating chart ever could. It wasn't an oversight, it wasn't a mistake, it was a conscious choice, a demotion. I had been downgraded from my position as matriarch, a role I had held for over 50 years, to something other, something less. I looked over at Lily. She was laughing at something Derek had said, her hand on his arm. She was so absorbed in her new life, her new unit, that she hadn't even noticed my absence, let alone my public banishment. She looked happy, and in her happiness, I had been rendered obsolete. I straightened up. The heat in my cheeks was gone, replaced by an icy calm. I looked at my daughter, truly looked at her, and for the first time I saw her not as the child I had raised, but as the stranger she had become. A woman who would place her own mother by a bathroom to make room for a son-in-law she'd known for a handful of months. A woman who valued appearances over affection and the future over the past that had built it for her. "I see," I said. It was the only thing I could manage. My voice was flat, devoid of the emotion that was churning inside me. I turned without another word. I did not look back. I walked not toward my designated seat in the shadows, but toward the gift table. It was piled high with expensive-looking bags and boxes. I held my own gift, the one I had wrapped with so much love, tightly in my hands. The hand-knitted cashmere blanket suddenly felt heavy, burdened with a love that was clearly not reciprocated, or at least not valued. The check for $6,000 felt like a ransom I had been paying for years to maintain my place in their lives. I knelt down, my old knees protesting, and gently slid the gift box deep under the table, hiding it behind the long, draping tablecloth. It was out of sight. A secret offering. Let them look for it, let them wonder. My love for that unborn child was unconditional, and it would remain there, a silent testament, even if I did not. Then I stood up, smoothed down my lavender dress, and walked. I walked past the string quartet, past the laughing women with their champagne, past the valet stand at the grand entrance. I pushed open the heavy glass doors and stepped out into the bright, warm afternoon. The sun felt good on my face. The air, free from the cloying scent of flowers and perfume, felt clean. No one called my name, no one ran after me, no one even noticed I was gone. As I got into my car and pulled away from the Oak Valley Country Club, I didn't feel angry. I didn't feel sad. I just felt empty. The sun of their solar system had just gone dark, and I was floating away into the cold, quiet expanse of space, utterly and completely alone. The drive home was a blur of green trees and gray asphalt. I operated the car on instinct alone, my mind a silent, whirring machine replaying the last hour on a loop. The seating chart, the chair, the words additional guest. Sarah's placid, dismissive smile, Derek's oblivious laughter. Each image was a fresh twist of the knife. I didn't cry. The pain was too deep for tears. It was a structural wound, a crack in the very foundation of who I was. I pulled into the driveway of the house I had shared with David for 4 years. It had never felt so large, so empty. Inside, the silence was a physical presence. I walked through the rooms, my hand trailing along the familiar furniture. Here was the armchair where I'd rocked both Sarah and Robert to sleep. There on the mantelpiece was a photo of Lily on her graduation day, her arms slung around my shoulder, a genuine, happy smile on her face. Had it all been a lie, a performance? Or was this new cruelty a recent development, a symptom of a sickness I had failed to diagnose? I sat in the kitchen, the heart of our home, and stared at the telephone on the wall, a relic from another era that I could never bring myself to remove. I expected it to ring. I waited for it, a call from Sarah, apologetic. A call from Lily, confused, asking where I'd gone. A call from Robert, the peacemaker, trying to smooth things over. I waited. An hour passed, then another. The sun began to dip lower in the sky, casting long shadows across the linoleum floor. The phone remained silent. The quiet confirmed the truth more than any shouted word ever could. My feelings did not matter. My presence was not required. Just as I had resigned myself to this stark reality, my cell phone, which I'd left on the counter, buzzed. My heart leaped with a foolish, stubborn hope. I picked it up, a missed call and a new voicemail from Sarah. My hands trembled as I pressed the button to listen. I leaned against the counter for support. Sarah's voice filled the quiet kitchen, but it was not the voice of contrition. It was tight, high-pitched, and laced with pure, unadulterated fury. "Mother, where in God's name did you go? Do you have any idea how embarrassing this is? People were asking where you were, and Lily is getting ready to open her gifts, and yours is nowhere to be found. Everyone is asking what my own mother got for her. What am I supposed to say? You can't just walk out and not leave the gift. Call me back this instant. You have completely ruined Lily's day." The message ended. I stood there, phone in hand, the last echoes of her shrill voice fading into the crushing silence. I played it again just to be sure, just to confirm that I hadn't imagined the words, the tone, the absolute and total lack of concern for anything other than appearances and the missing present. She wasn't angry that I was hurt. She was angry that I had embarrassed her. She wasn't worried that I was upset. She was worried that the gift, the monetary tribute, had gone missing. In that moment, a decade of grief for my husband, David, coalesced into a single, sharp point of pain. He would never have allowed this. He would have seen the rot setting in long ago. He would have protected me. But he was gone, and I had been left to fend for myself, blind to the slow erosion of my family's love. The hot shame I'd felt at the country club was gone. The deep, aching sadness that had followed me home was gone. In their place, something new and unfamiliar began to smolder. It was a cold, hard anger, an anger born not of a single insult, but of 1,000 tiny cuts inflicted over years. The Corningware dish, the constant financial emergencies. The slow, steady marginalization of my role until I was nothing more than a function, a utility, a walking, talking bank account with a knack for knitting. My phone buzzed again, this time with an incoming text message from that same number. It was Sarah, Where is the gift? My thumbs moved over the screen, my movements steady and precise. I felt a strange sense of detachment, as if I were watching someone else compose the message. My reply was short, simple, and I knew utterly infuriating. Already taken care of. I hit send, then I turned the ringer off on my phone and set it down on the counter. The burning had stopped. I felt nothing but a vast, empty clarity. The family I thought I had, the one I had dedicated my life to serving, was a fiction. The story I had been telling myself was over. It was time to write a new one. The immediate aftermath of my text message was a predictable storm of digital noise. My phone, even on silent, lit up with a furious intensity. First, it was Sarah, calling again and again. Each time her name flashed on the screen, I imagined her face, contorted with rage and confusion. She was a woman who was used to getting her way, to having her questions answered, to being in control. My quiet defiance was a wrench in the gears of her well-managed world. I let it ring. After about the fifth call from Sarah, the caller ID changed. It was Robert, my son, my soft-hearted, weak-willed boy. A part of me, a deeply ingrained maternal instinct, wanted to answer. I wanted to hear his voice, to believe that he at least would be calling out of concern, but I knew better. Robert was not the general, he was the lieutenant dispatched by his sister to try a different tactic. Where she used force, he would use guilt. I watched his name flash once, twice, 3 times. I pictured him in his sterile condo, pacing back and forth, phone pressed to his ear, no doubt with Sarah's voice barking instructions at him from his other phone's speaker. He called 11 times in a row. The sheer obsessive persistence of it told me everything I needed to know. This wasn't about me. This was a hunt for the $6,000 check. I walked into the living room and made myself a cup of tea, the familiar ritual, a small anchor in the turbulent sea of my emotions. As the water heated, I thought about Robert. I thought about the bright, confident young man he had been before his life had unraveled. I had tried to help him to rebuild his confidence with my support, both emotional and financial. But I saw now that I hadn't rebuilt him, I had merely propped him up. My generosity had become a crutch he'd forgotten how to walk without. It had enabled his weakness, making him susceptible to Sarah's stronger, more demanding personality. He wasn't calling to ask if I was okay, because his own well-being was now inextricably linked to my willingness to fund it. My silence was a threat to his stability. Sipping my tea in the growing darkness, the anger began to subside, leaving behind not sadness but a hard, clear resolve. For 10 years since David's death, I had been living my life for them. Every decision, every expenditure, every holiday was planned around their needs, their wants, their comfort. I had been living as a satellite to my own children, my own life secondary to theirs. The woman who had been placed by the bathroom was not the woman David had married. He had married a partner, a strong woman who had opinions and a will of her own. Where had she gone? I looked at the portrait of David on the mantelpiece. His eyes, so kind and intelligent, seemed to look right at me. I could almost hear his voice, that calm, steady baritone that had been my compass for 4 decades. "Don't let them walk all over you, Ev," he would have said. "Your value isn't determined by what you can give them, it's inherent." Inherent, the word resonated within me. My value was not in my bank account. It was not in my ability to knit a perfect blanket or host a perfect Christmas dinner. It was in me. It was mine, and I had allowed them to take it, to cheapen it, to put a price tag on it. And when I had failed to produce the expected payment at the baby shower, I had been discarded. My grief, once a dull, heavy blanket, was now a lens, focusing all my thoughts into a single, sharp point. I needed to protect myself. I needed to reclaim the life David had worked so hard to provide for me. I needed to honor his memory by honoring myself, but I couldn't do it alone. I was an expert in gardening and baking, not in legal warfare. My family, with Sarah's high-powered husband and their aggressive sense of entitlement, would surely fight back. I needed an ally. And then, like a lighthouse beam cutting through the fog, a name came to me. Arthur Vance, David's best friend since childhood. They had been like brothers. Arthur was a retired lawyer, one of the sharpest and most principled men I had ever known. After David died, Arthur had called me once a month for a year just to make sure I was all right. But life, as it does, had gotten in the way. I'd become consumed with my family's dramas, and our calls had dwindled. I hadn't spoken to him in nearly 2 years. I went to my old roll-top desk, the one that held all our important papers, and pulled out a worn leather address book. My hand was shaking as I flipped through the pages to the V section. There it was, Arthur Vance, with his address and phone number written in David's neat architectural script. For a moment I hesitated. It felt like a monumental step, an act of war. But then I looked back at David's portrait. This wasn't about war, it was about peace. My peace. My hand was steady as I picked up the phone and dialed the number. This was the first decision I had made entirely for myself in a very long time. This was me taking my first step out of the shadows and back into my own life. Arthur answered on the second ring, his voice exactly as I remembered it, a warm, comforting baritone, though perhaps a little gravelly with age. Arthur Vance speaking. "Arthur," I said, my own voice sounding thin to my ears. "It's Evelyn Reed." There was a moment of silence and then an audible smile in his voice. "Evelyn, my goodness, what a wonderful surprise. How are you? It's been far too long." His genuine warmth was a balm on my raw nerves. "I'm well, Arthur. I'm not entirely sure how I am," I began, and then the whole story just poured out of me. I told him everything. The excitement for the shower, the lavender dress, the seating chart, the insulting additional guest card, the confrontation with Sarah, her cold words about the new family unit. I told him about leaving the gift, the silent drive home, and the furious, demanding voicemail that had nothing to do with me. And everything to do with the missing check. He listened patiently, not interrupting once. He just made small sounds of acknowledgement, letting me know he was there. When I finished, the silence on the other end of the line was heavy. "Arthur, are you there?" I asked, suddenly worried I had burdened him. "I'm here, Evelyn," he said, his voice low and tight with an emotion I recognized as controlled anger. "That isn't just an insult. What your daughter did, that's a declaration. She declared that you are no longer essential. She is very, very wrong." He paused. "I'm coming over. Is tomorrow morning too soon?" The next morning, Arthur arrived precisely at 10 o'clock, carrying a worn leather briefcase that looked as though it had seen 1,000 battles. He was 80 now, a little stooped, but his eyes were as sharp and clear as ever. Seeing his kind, familiar face in my doorway was the first time I had felt truly safe since this ordeal began. We sat in the living room, a pot of fresh coffee between us. He didn't offer empty platitudes or tell me it was all a misunderstanding. He looked at me with profound empathy and said, "All right, Evelyn, they've made their position clear. Now we must make yours." He opened his briefcase, and for the first time I saw him not just as David's old friend, but as the formidable lawyer he had once been. He listened as I recounted the financial support I had provided over the years, the down payments, the college funds, the bailouts for Robert, the endless loans that were never meant to be repaid. I confessed that I had never kept a strict record, that I had given freely out of love. Arthur nodded grimly. "Love is a poor accountant, Evelyn. They have learned to equate your love with your checkbook. We need to teach them the difference." He explained my position with a clarity I had been unable to grasp on my own. My assets, my home, my investments, they were all mine, legally and unequivocally. The will David and I had drawn up years ago left everything to me, and then, upon my death, to be split equally between Sarah and Robert. "That will," Arthur said, tapping a pen on his legal pad, "was written under the assumption that your children would love and care for you in your old age. They have by their actions voided the spirit of that agreement, if not the letter. So, we will draft a new one." The idea was terrifying. It felt so final, so vengeful. "I don't want to punish them, Arthur," I whispered. they are still my children. This is not about punishment, he said gently but firmly. This is about protection, your peace of mind, your future. You have spent decades funding their lives. It is time to fund your own. The plan he laid out was simple in its logic and brilliant in its execution. First, we would establish a new, irrevocable living trust. The bulk of my assets would be placed within it, managed by a neutral third-party firm with me as the sole beneficiary for my lifetime. This would protect my estate from any future claims or challenges. Second, we would redraft my will. A significant portion of the estate, upon my death, would now be used to establish the David Reed Foundation, a charity dedicated to funding engineering scholarships for underprivileged students, something David would have adored. Third, we would set up a new system for my own finances. I would have more than enough to live comfortably, to travel, to pursue hobbies, to do whatever I wanted, without having to mentally subtract the amounts I was constantly giving to my children. What was left for Sarah and Robert would be a fraction of what they had expected. It would not be nothing. Arthur was firm that a vindictive will could be more easily challenged, but it would be a pittance compared to the fortune they had taken for granted. The most important part of this, Evelyn, Arthur said, his eyes meeting mine, is that you are in control. You can amend it if they show genuine remorse and change their ways. But the power to do so is yours and yours alone. They will no longer be able to treat you as a passive resource to be exploited. As he spoke, I felt a lifetime of obligation begin to lift from my shoulders. The idea of traveling, of seeing the world beyond the narrow confines of my family's needs, was a seed of excitement planted in the barren ground of my sorrow. The thought of a foundation in David's name brought tears to my eyes, a legacy of true generosity, not the transactional kind I had been practicing. By the time Arthur left that afternoon, the smoldering anger had been forged into a quiet, unshakable strength. I had a plan, I had an ally, and for the first time in a very long time I had a future that belonged to me. The following Thursday I made the call. I messaged Sarah and Robert in a group text, my tone formal and Brooke's no argument. I need to have a family meeting. Please be at my house this Sunday at 2 o'clock. It is very important that why. Oh, both attend. Lily and Derek are welcome too. Sarah's reply was almost instantaneous. Is this about the shower, Mother, if you're going to be difficult? I simply replied, Sunday 2 o'clock. The days leading up to the meeting were calm. I busied myself in the garden, pruning the roses and pulling weeds. With every weed I pulled, I felt as if I were clearing out the rot and decay in my own life. I felt no fear, no anxiety, just a steady, quiet purpose. Arthur had prepared all the necessary documents. He would be there not to speak, but to be a silent, legal witness to the proceedings. Sunday arrived, another bright, beautiful day. At precisely 2 o'clock, a car pulled into my driveway. It was Sarah's sleek German sedan. All four of them got out, Sarah looking impatient and annoyed, Robert looking nervous and avoiding my gaze, Lily looking sullen and put upon, and Derek with a look of smug curiosity on his face. They walked into my house as if they owned it, their sense of entitlement a palpable force in the room. All right, Mother, Sarah said, not even bothering to sit down. We're here. What is this all about? If you're expecting an apology for the seating arrangement, you should know it was the club's mistake. I gestured to the sofa. Please sit down. They exchanged glances, but reluctantly they sat. Arthur, who had been waiting in the kitchen, walked in and took a seat in the armchair by the fireplace, placing his briefcase on the floor beside him. His presence immediately changed the atmosphere in the room. Sarah's eyes narrowed. What is he doing here? She demanded. Arthur is here as my friend and legal counsel, I said calmly. I remained standing, feeling for the first time that this was my stage and they were the audience. I took a deep breath. I asked you here today because of what happened at the baby shower, not because of the club's mistake, Sarah, because we both know it wasn't one. I am here because of what that day made me realize. I looked at each of them in turn. For my entire life, and especially for the last 10 years, my primary purpose has been to support this family. I have done so with my time, with my love, and with my money. I believed that was my role and I took joy in it. But I see now that my role has been misinterpreted. You have come to see me not as your mother or grandmother, but as a financial institution, a service provider. An additional guest who is only welcome as long as she brings a sufficiently large gift. Robert had the grace to look ashamed, his eyes fixed on the carpet. Lily was examining her nails. Sarah scoffed. "Oh, that is ridiculous, we love you." "Do you?" I asked, my voice even. "Your love felt strangely absent when you placed me by the bathroom." "It was certainly absent from the voicemail you left me, Sarah, which expressed no concern for my feelings, only outrage over a missing check. Your love was absent in the 11 consecutive calls from you, Robert, which were not to ask if I was all right, but to hunt down the money." The room was silent. I had laid the facts out like stones, hard and undeniable. "Your actions have had consequences," I continued, my voice steady. "They have forced me to reevaluate my life and my future. With Arthur's help, I have made some new legal and financial arrangements to better reflect the new reality of our relationship." I picked up a document from the coffee table. "My will has been completely redrafted. The vast majority of my estate will now be used to create the David Reed Foundation, which will provide university scholarships to young engineering students. It is a legacy my husband would have been proud of." Sarah's mouth fell open. Robert's head snapped up, his face pale with shock. "Furthermore," I went on, my gaze unwavering, "I have placed my remaining assets into an irrevocable trust managed by an independent firm. It will provide me with a generous income for the rest of my life, allowing me to travel and to finally tend to my own needs. The yearly financial gifts you have both come to expect will cease, effective immediately. What little remains in the estate upon my death will be split between you, but I assure you, it will not be the windfall you have been planning on." The explosion was immediate. "You can't do this," Sarah shrieked, jumping to her feet. "That's our money. Dad wanted us to have that." "Mother, please," Robert pleaded, his voice cracking. "I need that help, you know I do." Lily was openly crying now, her face buried in Derek's shoulder. "My baby's trust fund," she sobbed. I listened to their panicked, greedy protests and I felt nothing, no pity, no anger, just a profound sense of release. They weren't mourning the loss of their mother, they were mourning the loss of their income. I held up a hand and surprisingly they fell silent. "The decisions are final," I said. "This is not a negotiation. What my husband wanted was for me to be cared for, respected and loved. You have all failed in that duty. This meeting is over." I turned my back on them, walked to the window and looked out at my garden. I heard Arthur's calm voice asking them to leave, the sound of their sputtering protests, the shuffling of feet, and finally the click of the front door closing. The silence that descended on the house was different this time. It wasn't empty, it was peaceful, it was the sound of freedom. I had not destroyed my family, I had simply stepped out of the rubble they had made of our relationship and chosen to save myself. I had won. It's been 3 months now. The silence from my family has been absolute. At first I thought it would be a lonely silence, but it's not. It's a quiet space that I am filling with my own life. I've booked a cruise to Alaska, something David and I always talked about. I've volunteered at the local library twice a week. I've had Arthur over for dinner. I am learning day by day to be the sun in my own sky. The greatest lesson in all of this is that you cannot let others define your value. True worth isn't something they can give you with a seat at their table, nor is it something they can take away by seating you by the bathroom. It's the light you carry inside yourself. For a long time, I let my light dim to make them comfortable. Now, I'm letting it shine.